The Galactic Council Chamber was an architectural marvel, a shimmering dome of translucent alloy suspended in the orbit of Paxar's central star. Inside, the air thrummed with tension as representatives of a dozen species argued in their native tongues. The cacophony of clicks, growls, and hisses echoed off the walls, a symphony of barely contained chaos. At the center of it all, Mark Halloway stood silent, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. To the untrained eye, Mark appeared calm, even detached, his gray suit a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and battle armor of the alien delegates. But those who looked closer might catch the faintest tightening of his jaw or the slight narrowing of his steel-blue eyes. He was assessing, calculating. This was not a room of equals. It was a den of predators, and humanity was a perceived prey. Tryan Vashtak, a delegate from the Sorit Dominion, rose to his full height, his elongated, serpentine body glistening under the chamber's pale light. His voice was a silken hiss, every word dripping with condescension. "Humans," he began, his slitted eyes narrowing. "It is a wonder you were invited to this esteemed council at all. Your species has offered little of value to the galactic community beyond quaint stories and primitive goods." A ripple of amusement spread through the chamber. The laughter was a discordant mix of guttural chortles and chittering giggles. Mark didn't flinch, though he felt his assistant, a young officer named Andrew Clark, stiffen beside him. Mark's gaze remained fixed on Tryan, his expression unreadable. "If I may respond," Mark said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The chamber quieted, though a few alien delegates exchanged smirks, as if anticipating an easy dismissal. Tryan coiled slightly, his body language radiating amusement. "By all means enlighten us, Ambassador." Mark stepped forward, the faint hum of his polished shoes on the chamber's floor the only sound. He took his time, letting the silence stretch just enough to unsettle. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, almost conversational. "It's fascinating, really, how quickly assumptions form. You see a species that values diplomacy over aggression, cooperation over conquest, and you conclude that we are weak. Harmless." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, lingering just long enough on each delegate to make them shift in their seats. "Do any of you know what humanity truly fears?" Zerkash Neverin, the insectoid leader of the council, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "Do enlighten us, Ambassador. What could such a primitive species fear?" Mark's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Ourselves." The single word hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible to most of the assembled delegates. Tryan let out a derisive hiss. Typical posturing. "You cannot expect us to." Mark raised a hand, silencing him. From the pocket of his suit, he withdrew a small device, no larger than a coin. With a flick of his thumb, it activated, projecting a holographic display into the air. The images that followed wiped the smirks from the aliens' faces. Scenes of Earth's history played in grim succession. Battlefields shrouded in smoke, the haunting glow of nuclear detonations, soldiers charging through trenches slick with mud and blood. The images transitioned seamlessly, showing modern warfare, precision drone strikes, satellite-guided missiles, cities reduced to ash in moments. The chamber was silent now, the weight of the images pressing down on everyone present. Mark allowed the projection to play for a moment longer before deactivating it. He looked directly at Tryan, his voice lowering to an almost dangerous calm. "What you just witnessed were the lengths humanity went to when we fought each other. And those were wars with rules." A murmur rippled through the room, subdued and uneasy. Tryan's serpentine body coiled tighter, his confident facade cracking. "Rules? You call that barbarism rules?" Mark inclined his head slightly. "Indeed. Rules we created because we had to, because unchecked, we discovered there were no depths to which we wouldn't sink to win. We created the concept of war crimes not for the sake of our enemies, but to contain ourselves." Zerkash's mandibles clicked in agitation. "And you expect us to believe that this restraint applies to us?" "That," Mark said, Stepping closer to the center of the chamber is entirely up to you. Trian's eyes narrowed, his voice rising in defiance. Enough theatrics. Humans are incapable of such horrors now. You've grown soft, dependent on this council to shield you. For the first time, Mark allowed a sliver of his true self to surface. His voice turned cold, his gaze cutting. You mistake restraint for weakness, Delegate Vashtak. Push us far enough, and you'll discover the difference. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices, the tension boiling over. Some delegates demanded sanctions against for the implied threats, while others, notably the reptilian counter representatives, watched Mark with newfound wariness. Zerkash called for order, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. Enough! This council will deliberate further on humanity's position. As the delegates began filing out, Trian slithered closer to Mark, his voice low and venomous. You think your little display frightened us? We will break you. Mark didn't look at him, his focus on the exit, but his parting words were sharp and deliberate. Pray you never have to try. When Mark and Clark finally exited the chamber, the younger man exhaled sharply, his tension evident. Do you think they'll back down? Mark glanced at his assistant, his expression unreadable. No, he said after a moment. But they'll think twice before underestimating us again. As they boarded their shuttle, Mark allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had delivered the warning, but whether the council heeded it was another matter entirely. Humanity's history was a double-edged sword, one they had learned to wield with precision. The question now was whether they would have to unsheath it. The private chamber was a stark contrast to the bustling galactic council floor. Soft, diffused light illuminated the room, casting elongated shadows on walls adorned with holographic projections of ancient treaties and interstellar accords. Mark Halloway stood at the center of the circular space, his hands resting lightly on the polished surface of a crescent-shaped table. Across from him, Zerkash Neverin's multifaceted eyes gleamed under the light, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm that betrayed his agitation. Your display earlier, Zerkash began, his voice a layered hum, was calculated but reckless. You have drawn attention to yourself and your species in a manner that will not be easily forgotten. Mark regarded the insectoid council leader with measured calm. Reckless would be remaining silent while the Sorath Dominion positions itself to dismantle humanity's standing. You may not see it yet, but their ambitions threaten more than just Earth. Zerkash tilted his head slightly. The movement as alien as it was unsettling. The Sorath are ambitious, yes, but they are not fools. They see you as an annoyance, not a threat. Mark leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. That's exactly why I acted. When they view us as prey, they become bold. But when prey bares its teeth, predators reconsider. Zerkash's mandibles flexed, his gaze sharpening. And what of the council? Do you mean to intimidate us as well? We value order, ambassador, not chaos. Mark's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. You misunderstand. My goal isn't to disrupt order. It's to remind the council of what's at stake. Humanity isn't here to dominate. But we won't allow ourselves to be trampled either. Zerkash clicked his mandibles once, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet chamber. You walk a dangerous line, Halloway. Even now, there are those among us who see your kind as a liability. Trian will exploit every misstep to convince the council you are a threat. Let him, Mark replied evenly. He underestimates us, and that arrogance will be his undoing. Zerkash stared at Mark for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he exhaled a low, chittering sound that might have been laughter. You play a bold game, Ambassador. I only hope your species is prepared for the consequences. As the insectoid leader left, Mark remained in the chamber, his reflection staring back at him from the polished surface of the table. The weight of his decisions pressed heavily on his shoulders. But he had learned long ago to carry such burdens without faltering. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small data chip. It contained classified intelligence reports. Details of Sorth maneuvers along the outer trade routes, indications of a buildup that could not be dismissed as routine. Andrew Clark entered the room quietly, his usual formality softened in the private setting. "The transport is ready, sir." "What did Zerkash want?" "To remind me of the risks," Mark replied, slipping the chip back into his pocket. "And to make sure I understand the precarious position we're in." Clark hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think they'll act on the sanctions?" "They'll try," Mark said, his voice carrying an edge of certainty. "Tryon won't let this go unanswered. He'll push for a demonstration, something to embarrass us and solidify their narrative of human incompetence." Clark frowned. "And if that happens—" Mark met his assistant's gaze, his tone calm but unyielding. "Then we remind them why humanity survived when stronger species fell." Clark's unease was evident, but he nodded, trusting in Mark's judgment. Together, they left the chamber, their path taking them through a corridor lined with statues of the Council's founding members. Each figure seemed to loom over them, a silent testament to the ideals of unity and peace. Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of their stares, a reminder that peace was always fragile, always temporary. The shuttle ride back to the human embassy was quiet, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to Mark's thoughts. Outside the window, the shimmering expanse of the Paxaris sector unfolded, its distant stars casting a cold, indifferent light. Clark broke the silence, his voice tentative. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it? Being here, fighting for a seat at their tables?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched as a cargo vessel drifted past, its hull bearing the insignia of a species he couldn't name, but whose survival depended, like all others, on cooperation. "It's worth it," he said finally. "Not because they accept us, but because we refuse to be erased." Clark nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Mark understood. The path they had chosen was fraught with peril, and the stakes were higher than most realized. Humanity was walking a tightrope, and one misstep could send them plummeting into the void. When they arrived at the embassy, Mark went straight to his office, a starkly functional space with little in the way of personal touches. A single photograph sat on his desk, a reminder of what he was fighting for, a world that no longer existed, replaced by one that had learned to endure. He stared at it for a moment before activating his terminal. The intelligence reports he had reviewed earlier flickered to life on the screen, their contents painting a grim picture. The Sorth Dominion was moving quickly, their fleets positioning themselves along key trade routes. The patterns were unmistakable. This was not a show of force, but the prelude to something far more dangerous. Mark's mind raced, piecing together the implications. They were baiting humanity, forcing a response that could justify escalation. Clark entered the office, a datapad in hand. "Preliminary reports from the outer colonies, sir. Increased Sorth activity in the Althena corridor. It's consistent with the intel you shared." Mark's jaw tightened. "They're daring us to act, and if we don't, then they'll strike first and frame it as a preemptive measure. Either way, they want to control the narrative." Clark hesitated, then asked, "What's the plan?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered the options. "We'll let them think they're in control for now. But when the time comes, we'll make sure they understand the cost of underestimating us." Clark nodded, his expression courage. He had seen enough of Mark's methods to trust in his leadership, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. As he left the room, Mark allowed himself a moment of reflection. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but it was one humanity had no choice but to walk. The terminal chimed, signaling an incoming message. Mark opened it, his expression hardening as he read the contents. The Sorth had issued an ultimatum, thinly veiled as a diplomatic request. The lines had been drawn, and the game was about to begin. Mark stared at the screen, his mind already calculating the moves and countermoves that would define the days to come. Humanity's survival depended not just on strength, but on the ability to outthink and outmaneuver their adversaries. And Mark Halloway was nothing if not a master of the game. The council chamber was silent when Mark Halloway strode into the center of the room. The translucent dome above glimmered faintly with starlight, but the usual hum of activity was absent. This was an emergency session, convened at the behest of the Sword Dominion, and every delegate in attendance knew the stakes. Mark could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others hostile, and a few carefully neutral. Traian Vashtak stood at his place, his serpentine form coiled tightly in barely concealed triumph. He gestured toward Mark with one elongated limb, his voice carrying a thin veneer of civility. "Ambassador Halloway, the Sword Dominion has brought evidence of human aggression that this council cannot ignore. Your species' actions along the Althena corridor violate our treaties, and we demand accountability." Mark said nothing at first, letting Traian's words echo through the chamber. His calm demeanor remained unshaken, even as the murmur of voices rose around him. Finally, he spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "Evidence, you say? I'd like to see this so-called proof." Traian's forked tongue flicked briefly, his amusement evident. "Of course. The Dominion is nothing if not thorough." With a flourish, Traian activated a holographic projection. The shimmering display showed a grainy recording of a Sword patrol vessel, its hull scorched and listing in open space. The voice of a Sword officer narrated the scene, describing an attack they claimed was carried out by a human strike force. Gasps and muttered exclamations rippled through the chamber. Traian turned to face the assembled delegates, his tone heavy with accusation. "This is what humanity brings to the galactic community: violence and destruction. They cloak their barbarism in the guise of diplomacy, but their true nature cannot be hidden." Mark stepped forward, his expression impassive. "You're certain this footage is genuine?" Traian sneered. "The evidence speaks for itself. Will you deny it?" "No," Mark replied evenly, his words drawing surprised glances. "I won't deny the footage, but I will challenge your interpretation of it." The chamber fell silent again as Mark activated his own device. A new projection appeared, this one showing a fleet of sword ships encircling an unarmed human convoy. The timestamp on the recording predated the incident Traian had presented. Mark's voice remained steady as he addressed the council. "What you see here is a pattern, a deliberate escalation orchestrated by the Sword Dominion. Their patrols have been harassing civilian vessels, cutting off vital trade routes, and forcing humanity into a corner. The incident they've shown you is not an act of aggression. It's a response to provocation." Traian's eyes narrowed, his coils tightening. "Lies! The Sword have done nothing to warrant such hostility. Your kind seeks only to justify your own savagery." Mark let the accusation hang in the air before answering. "Ambassador Vashtak, if humanity were truly the savage species you claim, this council wouldn't be debating our actions. It would be mourning the loss of your fleets." The chamber erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as delegates argued amongst themselves. Some shouted accusations at Mark, while others demanded explanations from Traian. Zerkash never struck the gavel sharply, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Order! There will be order." When the room finally quieted, Mark continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Humanity has made mistakes, more than I care to recount. But we have also learned from them. We understand the cost of unchecked conflict better than any species here. And that's why we've exercised restraint, even as the Sword Dominion pushed us to the brink." He turned to face the entire assembly, his gaze steady. "But there's a limit to every species' patience. If the Sword insist on testing ours, they will learn firsthand what happens when that patience runs out." Traian hissed, his voice sharp and venomous. "You threaten us in the very heart of this council? Do you think we will cower before your bluster?" Mark's expression hardened, the faintest edge of steel creeping into his voice. "It's not a threat, Ambassador. It's a warning. Push humanity far enough, and you won't just face our fleets. You will face a species that has perfected the art of war, and the darkest consequences of ignoring its rules." The air in the chamber grew heavy with the weight of his words. Mark could see the unease spreading among the delegates, even those who had been inclined to side with Traian. He pressed on, his tone unwavering. Do you know what war crimes are, Ambassador Vashtak? Do you understand why humanity created that concept? It's because we had to. Because without limits, we discovered there was no act too horrifying, no atrocity too great, that we wouldn't commit to ensure victory. And we don't want to return to that. Traian tried to interrupt, but Mark raised his hand, silencing him with a look. We abide by the rules of war not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to choose restraint. But if you force us to abandon that restraint, if you drag us back into the darkness, then you will see what humanity is capable of when the rules no longer apply. The chamber was deathly quiet now, the weight of Mark's words settling over the assembly like a shroud. Traian stared at him, his serpentine body frozen, his bravado shattered. Zerkash's voice broke the silence, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. You have made your point, Ambassador Holloway, but words alone will not resolve this crisis. What do you propose as a path forward? Mark took a deep breath, his tone softening but losing none of its resolve. A full investigation into the incidents along the Althena corridor, led by an impartial council committee. Both human and Sorith forces will stand down until the investigation is complete. If the Sorith Dominion has nothing to hide, they should have no objection. Traian's coils shifted uneasily, his silence speaking volumes. Zerkash inclined his head. A reasonable proposal. Let us put it to a vote. As the delegates began casting their votes, Mark stepped back, his expression unreadable. He had planted the seed of doubt, exposed the Sorith's machinations, and reminded the Council of Humanity's resolve. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. When the vote concluded, Zerkash announced the result. The motion passes. A committee will be formed immediately to investigate the claims. Mark allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. It was a victory, but a fragile one. The real battle was far from over, and the Sorith would not take this setback lightly. As he left the chamber, Clark fell into step beside him. That was intense, Clark said, his voice low. Mark nodded, his gaze distant. It's only the beginning. Traian won't stop until he gets what he wants, or until we make it impossible for him to continue. Clark hesitated, then asked, and if it comes to that? Mark's expression hardened. Then we remind the galaxy why humanity created the rules in the first place. The Sorith fleet arrived at the Althena corridor as expected, their ships blotting out the stars like a swarm of predators encircling their prey. Their command vessel, an imposing behemoth of blackened alloy and jagged edges, hung at the center, radiating menace. The silence over the comm channels was a calculated taunt, daring the human forces stationed nearby to act first. On board the Courage, Mark Holloway stood on the command deck, his expression calm despite the looming threat displayed on the holomap. Around him, the crew worked with practiced precision, their nerves carefully masked by years of training. Andrew Clark was at his side, his jaw tight as he studied the incoming data. They're holding position just outside the designated zone, Clark reported, his voice low. It's a show of force. They want us to flinch. Mark folded his arms, his gaze fixed on the projection. Then we won't. Maintain formation. No aggressive maneuvers. Clark hesitated. If they cross the line, Mark's voice was steel. Then we'll show them the cost of their arrogance. The minutes stretched into hours, the standoff crackling with tension. The human fleet, though smaller in size, held its ground with unwavering resolve. Every captain in the formation understood the stakes. They were not just defending their territory, but humanity's place in the galaxy. A sudden alert broke the stillness, and a junior officer turned to Mark, her face pale. Incoming transmission from the Sorith flagship. Priority signal. Mark nodded. Put it through. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing Traian Vashtak's serpentine form. His scales shimmered with artificial light, and his eyes gleamed with malice thinly veiled as civility. Ambassador Holloway, Traian began, his voice dripping with mockery. It seems we find ourselves at a crossroads. Your fleet is in violation of our space, and yet you act as though we are the aggressors. Mark stepped forward, his tone measured but unyielding. Your fleet crossed into the corridor first, Ambassador. The Council's investigation is still ongoing, and your presence here is a blatant attempt to undermine its authority. Trian's tongue flicked out, a gesture of disdain. Authority? The Council's authority is a fragile construct, as fleeting as starlight. Strength is what determines the outcome of disputes, not idle deliberation. And yet, Mark replied, his voice cutting, it's humanity's restraint that has kept this from escalating into war. But if you insist on testing our strength, you may find the outcome less favorable than you imagine. Trian hissed, his amusement fading into something colder. You overestimate your position, human. Your fleet is outnumbered, outmatched. Surrender now, and perhaps we will spare what remains of your species. Mark's expression hardened. You won't get the chance. With a subtle gesture, he activated a silent command, sending a signal to the fleet. The Courage's lights dimmed briefly as its systems recalibrated, preparing for the next phase of the confrontation. Trian's image flickered with irritation. A bluff, no doubt, but it will not save you. The transmission cut, and Mark turned to Clark. All ships, execute Protocol 13. Clark's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded, relaying the order. Around the fleet, human vessels shifted into position, their movements precise and deliberate. Energy signatures spiked as experimental weapon systems came online. Technologies developed in secret and held in reserve for moments like this. The Sorith fleet responded immediately, their ships advancing in a coordinated assault. Beams of energy lanced through the void, seeking to overwhelm the human defenses. But the human fleet was ready. The Courage's hull shimmered as its adaptive shielding absorbed the brunt of the initial volley. Smaller vessels darted through the chaos, deploying decoys and countermeasures that disrupted the Sorith formations. Mark watched the unfolding battle with unwavering focus, his mind a symphony of strategy and anticipation. Sir, the Ironclad is reporting heavy fire on their port side, Clark said, his voice tight. Tell them to hold position, Mark replied. Their flank is critical to maintaining the formation. Reinforcements are on the way. A brilliant explosion lit up the holomap as one of the Sorith cruisers was struck by a concentrated barrage, its hull splitting apart in a cascade of debris. Cheers erupted from the Courage's crew, but Mark remained composed. Stay focused, he said. This isn't over yet. The battle raged on, each side pushing the other to their limits. Human ingenuity clashed with Sorith aggression, and the void itself seemed to tremble under the weight of their conflict. Mark knew that victory would not come from brute strength alone. It would require precision, adaptability, and an understanding of his enemy's weaknesses. As the Sorith flagship advanced, its weapons charging for a devastating strike, Mark made his move. Prepare the arc lance, he ordered. Clark hesitated. Sir, if we use that now, they'll retreat, Mark interrupted, and we'll have made our point. Do it. The Courage's crew worked quickly, their hands flying over controls as the ship's most powerful weapon came online. The arc lance was a marvel of engineering, a weapon designed not just for destruction, but for psychological impact. Its energy output alone was enough to cripple a fleet, but it was the spectacle of its deployment that truly set it apart. A blinding beam of light erupted from the Courage, cutting through the darkness like a blade. It struck the Sorith flagship directly, piercing its shields and carving a path through its hull. The ship reeled from the impact, its systems failing as fires raged across its surface. The rest of the Sorith fleet faltered, their formations breaking apart in the face of the human counterattack. Mark seized the moment. All ships advance. Push them back to their side of the corridor. The human fleet surged forward, their combined firepower overwhelming the disorganized Sorith forces. One by one, the enemy vessels retreated, their confidence shattered. As the last of the Sorith ships disappeared into the void, a hush fell over the Courage. The battle was over, but the weight of what had been accomplished hung heavily in the air. Clark approached Mark, his expression a mix of relief and awe. "They're retreating, sir." "We did it." Mark nodded, his gaze still fixed on the holomap. "For now. But they'll be back. And next time, they'll be more prepared." Clark frowned. "What do we do?" "We keep building," Mark replied. "We adapt, just like we always have. And when they come again, we'll remind them why humanity endures." The Courage's comm system crackled to life, a message from the Council summoning Mark to report on the confrontation. He sighed, his exhaustion briefly visible before he steeled himself once more. As the ship prepared to return to the Council station, Mark allowed himself a moment of reflection. The Soreth had underestimated humanity, just as so many others had before them. But this victory was not just a statement to the Soreth. It was a reminder to the entire galaxy. Humanity was not to be trifled with, and though they fought for peace, they would never shy away from the darkness if it meant securing their place among the stars. The stars outside the Courage's viewport seemed a little brighter now, their light a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Mark knew the battles ahead would be even harder, but he also knew this. Humanity was ready,